So, how to set up your Lead Precision Loadmaster's priming system to perfection. You're going to need a couple of tools here. You will need an 11 spanner, 2 of them if you've got. If you don't, like me, you've got a shifting spanner also. You're going to need a fired case with the old primer still intact, that you haven't decapped. Why? Because that primer has been seated to perfection. Even if you seated it a bit high previously on your press, your firing pin heating it has seated it perfectly. So we'll use this to set the priming system. You're going to need a couple of primers. We're going to need a couple of cases. And then we are going to need a case gauge. Because setting up the sizing die forms part of the package of the priming system. I'll show you later how that works. So you need a case gauge. If you do not have a case gauge, take your barrel out of your gun safely, and you can use that to drop your cases in there to see if they're sized perfectly. But first, we need to understand how this system works. And if we understand how this priming system works, it will just make life easier for us. So let's look at how this works. So there's 2 parts to the priming system on a Loadmaster. Let's look at the first part that's happening right here with the press at the top of the stroke. Now, very important to notice, there's a handle stop here. Now, that's the top of the stroke of the press. If you are priming and there's a gap there, something's interfering and it's not allowing the press to totally reach the handle stop there, you're going to have priming issues. So make sure of that. We'll get back to that when we set up the sizing die. Now, we have this bolt here, primer actuating bolt here. This activates the rocker in the carrier that lifts the priming pin in station 2. Now, you'll notice there's a bit of play there. That's how it's supposed to be. So the setting of this bolt here is very important. That activates how far the priming pin will raise in the carrier in station 2. Now, that will happen at the top of the stroke. That's very important to notice. Now, let's look at the second part of the priming system on this press. Now, the second part of the priming system, I'll call it part 1 and part 2. Part 1 happens this side, part 2 happens here, at your primer trough. Now, if you look at the design of the primer trough, it's got this little arm here that will fetch a primer there and place a primer when it's pushed to the front. That's designed so that if there's no case in the system, a primer will not be fed. Now, these 2 parts need to work in cohesion. It's a balance of timing, so it needs to be perfect. This pin must rise only when the primer is seated on top of it. Now, if you set this bolt too deep, this pin is going to rise too early, and the primer is going to not sit on top of it. It's going to flip the primer or crush the primer, and your reloading session is not going to go well. So this little arm here is very important. Now, a case will come past here, push it to the back, and as the carrier rises, there's a primer wedge bar here that will push this all the way to the front, and that will place the primer on the primer pin, and we will prime your case at the very top of the stroke. So the timing of those 2 features is critical to this press. So just to show you, here's your primer wedge bar. This will push the primer arm forward to place the primer on top of the priming pin. So this is held in place here with a screw in the top here that needs to be tight, and you need to align it to make sure that it pushes on the back of this, that it's pushing this primer arm all the way forward. That's basically how you want it. Then that must be tight, and this bolt must be tight. If there's play in this bolt or there, you're going to have issues. So just have a look at that. Now, let's look at how to set it up. Okay, so first step that we have to do to set up the priming system on this press is remove your turret. Okay, turret lock here, just undo it, remove the turret. Quick tip on the turret lock, if you find it coming loose while you're loading, a bit of plumber's tape on it, it will tighten it up there for you. Okay, so remove your turret. Then you don't want any primers in the system. Okay, now this bolt here, take your 11 spanner, undo the top bolt, turn it all the way down, turn the bolt all the way to the top, as far as you can go to the top. Now, we have to cycle the press. And we're going to see there's a lot of play there now. So now we are going to take the case with the spent primer in it. We're going to feed it into the system. It's at station 2 now. So now we're going to go all the way to the top. And we'll notice there's a lot of play. And we'll turn this bolt down till it makes firm contact with the rocker bolt. There's almost no play in the system. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to turn this bolt. Once we do that, we want to turn that bolt 2 more sides of the bolt head out and leave it there. So take the press to the top again there to help you. Take your spanner, your shifting spanner, or your other 11 spanner. Hold that one tight. Now, just do this bolt up. Okay. Now, with that case with a spent primer in there, there's no play. You take that case out. We go to the top again, and you'll notice there's play there. And if you look closely there, that's about the size of a primer. Very important. So that is set up perfectly now. Okay, now we'll go to the next step in setting this press up to prime perfectly. Okay, the next thing you want to do to ensure that your priming system is working perfectly is to set your sizing die. So we need to reinstall our turret. So just line it up more or less. As you turn it to lock, it will align itself. If a turret lock works itself loose, just add a bit of plumber's tape on it. It will just secure it more properly there. So now we need to set up our sizing die. Now in previous videos and these instructions, everything, they say turn the sizing die down and then a quarter more. That quarter more is to take out any play in the press. Now if you notice on a Loadmaster, there isn't a lot of play. It's got a big ram, it's got a chunky handle, chunky body. There isn't a lot of play. So, look at this. I'm going to turn my sizing die in till it touches. And I'm ensuring that I'm engaging the handle stop here. Touching with firm contact there. Okay, lock that locker in. Take a case, and here's another tip. On a press like the Loadmaster, everything happens at the top of the stroke. You are priming, you're sizing, you're powder through, you are flaring, you are seating bullets, you are crimping. Everything happens at the top of a stroke. Make it easy on yourself. Lube your cases. It just makes life so much easier on a progressive press. And that will ensure that you don't short stroke the press, because that's another problem that can happen. So, sizing all the way. I am engaging the handle stop. Coming out. Case gauge time. Now, take your case gauge. Gear it. Dropped in perfectly. Falls out freely. That case is sized perfect. No need for that quarter turn there. That quarter turn is where problems happen on these presses. So, set your sizing die up and make sure that you are only taking it deep enough to size properly. Don't just do the quarter more turn, and don't go deeper than that. Remember, on these presses, your sizing die, and if you are running a factory crimp die, are the only 2 dies that must touch the shell plate. Your powder through die, your bullet seating die must not touch your shell plate. Okay, I've got videos there on YouTube there, you can search there on how to set up the dies. But remember, on a Loadmaster, that quarter turn is not always necessary. If you find that the case is not sizing all the way, you can turn the die in a little bit more, but make sure you are not taking away from the handle stop. This is very important. Taking away from there and doing things like that is interfering with your priming system's timing. Remember that we spoke about this bolt and the primer pin rising and the primer through feeding the primer onto the pin. If that timing's out, problems are here. Have a look there. So, We're happy with it, sizing die, but let's just test it again. All the way. And plunk. Perfect. So now, let's load a couple of primers into the system. Remember, gravity fed system, so it needs to be full. If it's empty, it's not going to feed the primers. Very important that with this lead priming feeding systems. If you look at your primer trough of the Loadmaster, it's got two windows in there. If the top one is empty, refill. Okay. And these little plastic trays from Lee, I like them. I think it's the best thing out there. Just make sure it's a plastic injection molded part. Just make sure that when you have it in a locked position, it actually locks and you don't have primers falling out. So there's a little bit of play there. So we're going to put that in and we're going to switch it on. Can you hear that shake? That's your primer trough. Has got a plastic tab on the back and it rides on the back of a press here. There's two little tabs. Number one, number two. That keeps the primers feeding into the system. Remember, it's a gravity fed system. It needs the primers to be fed all the way, otherwise the one at the bottom is not going to prime successfully. There's two windows in the primer trough. If the top window is empty, fill up with primers. So, let's test our priming system. I can feel it. And you see that? Primed. Flat, primed perfectly, no indentation, 100%. That is what you want out of your Loadmaster's priming system. Test it again. Perfection. Perfectly primed. So that's your priming system set up perfectly. Now, top tips. Do not adjust this bolt too far down. Make sure that you are engaging the stop here. Make sure this bolt and the primer wedge is tight. Make sure when you're setting up your dies that you are not interfering with the height of the press here by taking away from the handle stop. Sizing die is critical. Factory crimp die is critical. Those are the only two ties that must touch the shell plate on this press. Nothing else touches. So if you've got your bullet seeking die touching, you've got issues. Redo your die setups. So that's a Loadmaster priming system setup as it should be. I hope this has helped you and I hope you enjoyed this video. Till next time.